What are we talking about today? Primarily, well, today I'm going to be talking about, of course, the end of the Reconstruction era, which, doesn't go quite like it should have gone, if you know about Reconstruction. And I'll talk about that. And then we'll start talking about the beginning of the Gilded Age that they have, of course, which that's mostly what they call this period we're in now, from Reconstruction up to like the 1890s. They often call it the so-called Reconstruction era. Or Gilded Age. So we've got last lecture. I think the last thing I talked about was I was kind of getting into like the Ku Klux Klan and all that, and I think that was one of the last things we had done. We talked about the Amnesty Act, the enforcement acts. I think those are some of the last stuff we did in the 1870s. We're kind of getting up to like the end of Reconstruction, and so the first thing I need to talk about today. So I need to get into like what they call the New South. I haven't really talked about that term yet, which is a term they use a lot starting in the 1870s, in the 1880s. And it's a term that was coined by Henry W. Grady, who was actually an Atlanta Constitution newspaper editor. He kind of used the term. It was kind of like this slogan. Some people call it propaganda if you want to as well, but a lot of people call it an American slogan that became popular in the late 19th and into the 20th centuries. It was this idea to try to make the United States more like an industrialized country like the North is. So that was the whole point of what they were trying to do with that. I've got like numerous slides on this. Of course, with mostly as you know, the whites in control, of course, in the South, as you'll see later, because of segregation and all that. And so you got the rise of the New South, which they wanted to try to create a more diversified South that had not just one crop, which is cotton, which it had for a long time, but they wanted to have other crops, other industries as well. So the whole point was to try to, put other industries in power like coal, iron, tobacco, cotton, lumber, all those together, as one big industries to kind of, industrialize and modernize the South more than anything. Of course, at the time, it was very agrarian. If you go back to around the Civil War and before that, most of the South was agrarian. And you had some iron starting to develop like around Birmingham in Alabama, as example. And eventually they will get better with textile mills, of course, tobacco already at that point, more or less. And then over time, they'll try to expand their economy. But if you know much about the South, for a long time, it still relied a lot on agriculture, like most of I think 2/3 or more. And cotton was still, grown a lot. Of course, partially why was because of the fact that it was like the only crop you could actually make money on. It's like a cash crop. The other one's not so much overall. Also, you'll see later the type of farming they have to rely a lot on is either tenant farming or sharecropping. That was because of a shortage of money. So it's kind of difficult to pay people wages because of a lack of money in circulation. Cash in the South. So that was kind of a problem that they had. Also, the rise of segregation, was a big thing in the South, especially after Reconstruction ended. And you have all these so-called Jim Crow laws that are basically created in the late 1800s, more or less, where everything's segregated up to like the 1950s and 1960s for a long, long time. So yeah, let me get first and talk about, of course, I guess we'll go ahead and talk about segregation because that's one of the main things. Actually, I need to talk about sharecropping first. Let's do that first, about sharecropping. Yeah, sharecropping was, of course, one of the first things that you start seeing a lot, of course, in the South afterwards. They had different kinds of farmers. Like, if you were like a tenant farmer, you were a minority. There was very few people really that was doing that. Like you could buy land, but of course nobody had any money, which was kind of part of the problem as well. And yeah, majority of people did sharecropping, not just people that are African American, but a lot of whites also did sharecropping as well. As much as 80% for African Americans in general did it. What's the difference between tenant farming and sharecropping, more or less? Well, sharecropping, first tenant farming. Tenant farming is where it basically you rented land, like say from a landowner, and you had to have your own capital. So that meant that you had to have like your own animals to work the land, buy the seed, whatever kind of equipment you need to farm, basically. And so that's what we call a tenant farmer, pretty much. So it's not like a hired hand or maybe a foreman or something like that, which might just work for somebody or maybe wages or whatever. And then you have your so-called sharecroppers. And so sharecroppers, basically, you didn't own the land, you didn't have any capital, you didn't have anything except labor, pretty much. And so you basically worked the land for a share of the crop. And usually you had to give like half of your crop to the landowner in return, basically. And believe it or not, you weren't paid money for it. You were paid, usually they would pay you these tokens or something like that, where you could go buy something from like the store. Maybe if there was a plantation, you would go buy from the plantation store or a local grocery store, whatever store it is. And then you would either buy whatever you need or pay off your debts. And of course, in a lot of cases, a lot of them, they couldn't get out of debt. And so it was like a cycle of poverty, really, being a sharecropper. But for a long time, like up to the 1900s, a lot of people did that. Sharecropping was quite common, more or less. So yeah, you have all that going on. By the way, also at the New South, I didn't talk about this, but what was that? I kind of skipped it, but yeah, besides, change in agriculture, there was also a lot of urbanization. So you do have a lot of cities that start sprouting up, like Nashville, Tennessee, you've heard of, or Richmond, or Atlanta, Georgia. But most areas of the South were very rural and mostly based on pretty much farming. And you can see where all the farms were and where all the sharecropping was. So areas where you see, I think, where it's, mostly sharecropping the most would be in the blue areas. So especially see a lot Georgia, South Carolina. You see how blue that is in those areas. You can see around Louisiana where it's at, close to the Mississippi River, about kind of in the eastern part of Louisiana right here, parts of Mississippi as well, Texas as well, in those areas. All right, now I need to also talk about how African Americans were also disenfranchised. That's something, of course, you see a lot that happens, of course, in the South, especially as Reconstruction began to end, more or less. So there's different methods of it. You see those are the main methods, of course, they had, which you can see a lot of those are like the poll tax and literacy tests that they would have overall. So a lot of states, by the end of especially the 1800s, began to create a lot of these types of laws. Even Louisiana did this, Mississippi, and a bunch of other states in the South as well. Poll tax, was basically a tax to vote, which they used to do, kind of like a head tax, mostly on just men. And so if you couldn't pay the tax, well, you couldn't vote. That's one thing. Also, they have literacy tests that they would have to, like when you go to register to vote, you'd have to be able to read something. And it's not something where it's like you have to be able to read, like, it's a sentence or whatever. They would literally make you sit there and say, go ahead and recite the Constitution of the United States of America. Something crazy like that. And of course, you couldn't do it. And so you couldn't pass. If you know what happened, you had whites that were, poor and they couldn't pay the tax. So they couldn't read and write and stuff like that. So they had what they call the grandfather clause. You may have heard about that. And so basically what that meant is if your grandfather had voted like before the Civil War, you could vote. So it was kind of something tricky they did with that. And so a lot of African Americans were disenfranchised. It's happened especially with, like in Louisiana, with the I think the Louisiana Constitution of 1890. They started disenfranchising a lot of African Americans as an example of that. Of course, the big thing that happened, if you know about this, was the so-called Jim Crow or segregation laws that were created that separated basically whites from blacks, pretty much. This happened not just in the South. They talk about the South, but it happened up north too. They did this as well. A lot of northern states did it as well. Started like in trains and things like that. And then over time, it went to anything public, from restaurants to hotels, bars, bathrooms, water fountains, schools, and so on. Of course, for a long time, they called a lot of the laws Jim Crow. Like, what was the deal with that? Why do they call them Jim Crow laws? Well, the term Jim Crow evolved from these, I don't know if you ever heard of these minstrels that they used to put on in the South. They call them Negro minstrels, I think is what they dubbed them. And so you had these white actors that would go around and they'd paint their face black, blackface, I think they called it. And they kind of make fun of African Americans, and it's kind of crude today, but that's what they did. It was real popular. And there was a song that was called Jim Crow. I think that came out in 1828. And hence the term Jim Crow was basically a nickname for someone who was black, basically. So black laws or Negro laws, whatever you want to call them. And so that's what it meant, basically. I don't know if you've ever been to Saints games. They keep chanting, who dat, who dat, who dat, stuff like that. Who dat going to beat the Saints or whatever. Yeah, actually, a lot of those minstrel shows, they'd actually have actors that would say that. Who dat? Who dat just say who dat? Or something like that, they would say, or something like that. And that's kind of where that came from. A lot of those minstrel shows, more or less. What gave segregation, of course, teeth? You're going to see, like, over time, a lot of states are going to, continuously pass laws like this that segregate, whites from blacks, over time. You can see there's some famous pictures of some of the segregation. So if you wanted to go to the theater, watch a movie, there was a white theater and they had a black theater. It's kind of weird. Even the military was segregated. Yeah, the military for a long time, up to I think President Truman, the military was segregated, between black and white, and so on. Segregated schools for a long. Actually, New Orleans for a while after the Civil War was not. It was integrated, but then they started segregating everything pretty much later. Of course, here's a picture of the minstrel shows I'm talking about, where these actors would, like I said, wear blackface, as you see right there. So that's where it came from, more or less. But yeah, the story of Homer Plessy, that's pretty much one of the reasons why segregation became more legal, more or less. You probably heard the story of Homer Plessy. He was actually from New Orleans. And Plessy was this African-American that was only 1/8 black. He was actually 7/8 white, believe it or not. And he tried to challenge some kind of Louisiana law about segregation on trains, where he had like a white train and a colored train they had. It was in 1892. And when he tried to ride, I think in the white section, he got arrested. And so it went to the Louisiana Supreme Court, where it was rejected. And then he tried to get it appealed to the Supreme Court in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. And what happened was they ruled against him, saying that separate but equal facilities was legal because it didn't really violate the 14th Amendment, they thought at the time. And so basically that what Plessy versus Ferguson did was it gave basically segregation teeth, is what it did. It made it strong. And so after that, a lot of states started passing more and more of these laws, even put it in their constitutions, and it became legal pretty much. So that's how it basically got started, pretty much, segregation. But it wasn't just in the South. A lot of people thinking, it was just in the South and all that, but it was also basically in the North as well. Everything was also segregated, overall. So that's what the whole point was. It's basically separate, equal facilities for everybody. But if you know about it, it wasn't often equal. That's the thing about it. Both have these supposed to have separate schools or whatever, but they're not. The money's not being put into the black schools compared to, say, the white schools. So now the other thing that happened too, which is very famous, about that period. So as everything starts getting segregated, and all of that, They've got these two different African-American leaders that are kind of important in the late 19th century. You've got, Booker T. Washington, and W.B. Du Bois. Both those two, leading voices, and they're kind of critical of each other if you know about those two men. And here's kind of the differences between the two. You can see Booker T. was actually born a slave in Virginia. His mother was a slave. I think his father was actually white, believe it or not, Booker T. Washington. He believed vocational education was important. You got to get some kind of job skill or something, agriculture or some kind of industry. And so that's why he went to Hampton Institute, which became Hampton University in Virginia today. And of course, Booker T. Washington was very instrumental in starting Tuskegee, which is now a university in Alabama. And he thought that, I think he talked about the gospel of work. It was one of the things that Washington believed. He believed if African Americans worked hard, they got, training and all that, skills and all that, that over time they would get gradual equality of whites. And so that's what kind of he favored more or less. And but he was kind of unpopular with some African Americans because they thought he didn't go far enough and he should get more rights. But at the time, it was kind of difficult for them to do that, in the South, in the 1800s. And then on the right, you've got W.B. Du Bois, who was from Massachusetts, of course, never born a slave. And he was highly educated. I don't know if you know about Du Bois. He went to Harvard. He was the first African American to get a PhD. And Du Bois believed that African Americans, if they want to major in anything, even liberal arts, they should be able to do whatever they want, get every kind of skill or whatever. And so he believed that African Americans should seek more equality, civil rights in general. And so his view of what Washington was doing, he called Washington like an Uncle Tom. He thought he was kind of going about it the wrong way. And both had famous works, like Washington had Up From Slavery, it's well known. And then Du Bois has a collection of essays that are well known called The Souls of Black Folk. So both were famous like authors or writers as well. So those are kind of the difference between the two, more or less. And so, so like he favored vocational education, more or less. And then he favored way more liberal arts. So I think one of the more liberal arts, I think. And of course, the one thing about Du Bois that is very famous I've got, Du Bois was one of the men that, of course, helped develop the NAACP. That's well known today. That helped to give African Americans more rights in America. So-called Niagara movement, it's dubbed. And in that little short video, they talked about how I think Booker T. Washington had the Atlanta Compromise, where he kind of compromised with whites in general. And so Du Bois thinks that they shouldn't do that they should fight, for more political, civil, social rights as African Americans. And so that's something that the Niagara movement was really about, which met first in 1905 at Niagara Falls in New York. So that's something that's going to be a while. It's going to take, African Americans a while to get, full civil rights in general. And it's something you'll see more, especially after like World War II. You'll see that more like the 1950s, striving more towards that. But at the time, it was very difficult, in like especially in the rural South, in the 1800s, to do much. It's going to take a long time for that to kind of come about. Right. So the next thing I need to move on to, so I'm kind of pretty much, I'll get more into what happens with the Reconstruction era. It kind of ends, with the 1876 election, which I haven't quite got to, but I'll get to that next a little bit later. But I first want to start a new period, which kind of comes in, which is well known in the late 1800s, and that is the so-called Gilded Age, they call it, which occurs from like 1860s up to like the 1890s. It's a so-called post-Civil War America. Usually starts under Grant's administration and goes up to like the period of imperialism. And America started to become like a imperial power, more or less. And where does the term come from? Well, the term Gilded Age was from, I'll kind of first tell you what it is first. Here's the period where it's from, you see there. But You've heard of Mark Twain. I think I mentioned him before. He's a very famous novelist, probably one of the greatest American novelists of all time. Wrote, Huck Finn and all that, Huckleberry Finn. And he wrote a satirical novel called The Gilded Age, which I think was published, I want to say 1873, I think was the year. And it was making fun of like all these speculators and politicians that were kind of taking advantage of the country after the Civil War. They're getting rich and all that. And they're all corrupt. This era was called the Gilded Age, but a lot of people dubbed it the era of good stealings because everybody was using bribery, corruption, graft to make as much money off of what they were doing for a living. So they were a politician. They were trying to make money off of that. Industries were kind of doing unscrupulous, means to kind of make money. And so it's considered one of the most corrupt periods in American history. And it's also known for a lot of corrupt elections, especially the one in 1876, which, ended Reconstruction early, which it did. I'll get to it later, but the Gilded Age is also, we'll get to I think later in the week, hopefully I should probably on Thursday get to talk about the American West and all that. That's part of it as well, because America expands westward towards California, as you know. Rise of industries like capitalism and big business takes off. And they even throw in the imperial period, like new imperialism of America, like we'll take over Cuba and all that. That's basically, something that is part of that period, as well. A lot of the corruption, of course, that happened, in this period happened under Grant's administration. I think I talked about this before about Grant. Here's, of course, a slide if you want to see Mark Twain right there on the left, a picture of him. But a lot of the corruption started under General Grant. Grant's administration was one of the most corrupt in American history. It was a pattern of corruption you could see both in and outside of politics, not just politically in Washington, but like in industries and things like that. Grant was really a great general, but a lot of people kind of deem him on the political side of it. He's not as well known for being as good of a politician. I think they usually put him in the middle somewhere as like a kind of a mediocre president. He's not bad, but he's not good either. Pretty much. And you see a term Grantism. That was often a term they used for a lot of the corruption that occurred, which is a pattern which, Senator Charles Sumner kind of talked about which plagued his administration. So it happened quite a lot. And so they called it that more or less. Grant's administration was known for a lot of famous scandals that broke out, most of them in the 1870s, I think, probably at least from 1869 to 76, I think, was the peak of them predominantly. Here's a bunch of them. They have the Credit Mobile scandal. They have the Whiskey Ring scandal, the Belknap scandal, which they had different names for that one. It was called the Trader scandal or something like that. They called it. Gold Fist, Gold Ring scandal, I think was another thing. Boss Tweed, you may have heard about that one. The Boss Tweed scandal, of course, in New York was also big, which was kind of separate from Grant, but it also happened about the same time under him. So I'll kind of talk about some of these scandals that they had, of course. And there was one that happened probably the earliest on they always talk about that was well known. And that was the one that was about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And I don't know if you know much about that one, but the Transcontinental Railroad was part of a act passed by Congress called the Pacific Railway Act, which built basically a railroad that would connect the East Coast with the West Coast of the United States. Something they'd been trying to develop before the Civil War. Like I think Jefferson Davis had been trying to develop it, supposedly. Anyway, it created like these two railroads that would eventually build it. One was called the Union Pacific, and then the other was called the Central Pacific. The railroad's about, I think, almost 1,800 miles long. And the railroad, I'll put it on the screen here, but the railroad went basically from Omaha, Nebraska, where it started, and it would go all the way to Sacramento, California. So it linked up basically the Midwest with California. And anyway, yeah, these are the two routes. So you got the Union Pacific and you got the Central Pacific. The one on the left, the Union Pacific, that one was the more corrupt one. The company that built the eastern part of the leg of the railroad, and it made a lot of money off of the building of the railroad by kind of exaggerating how much the actual building costs were, which is something it's kind of known for. They did complete it, which that's the wrong date. It was actually completed on May 10th, 1869. Finished, they met at Promontory Point, which is in Utah. That's where it was actually finished, more or less. But they discovered later, a few years later, that in 1872, that there had been a bunch of corruption involved with it, apparently, and had to do with this scandal they had, which was called the Credit Mobile scandal, that it was often dubbed. Yeah, Credit Mobile. You may have heard about this. And apparently there was a politician in Congress. His name was Oakes Ames. He was from Massachusetts. And he had this brother that he put in charge of it. Was basically the president of it. And the company was phony. It was a phony company to basically try to, I guess, overcharge the government in I guess false contracts, more or less. And apparently what happened was they overcharged the government by about $44 million. In fact, it only cost $50 million to actually build the Union Pacific's actual part of the actual Transcontinental Railroad. And then they said it cost actually about, I think they said it was like $94 million to actually build it. So they basically ripped them off by a bunch of money. So that was one of the guys on the Oakes Ames, who was a politician in U.S. Congress, basically involved in it. And they actually think that it wasn't just him; it was other politicians. Like they had actually both of Grant's vice presidents they believe had bought stock in this company as well. So you had all these politicians that were basically in Congress making money off of this, building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So it became a real big scandal, one of the first, I guess, major scandals you hear about in American history. And some went to prison, but I think some of them got off, if you know about that at the time. They also what they call the Big Four. I don't know if you've heard of them. They built the so-called Central Pacific Railroad. They often called themselves the Associates. These were four men that were kind of in charge of the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad that ran from Sacramento to Utah. And there was a man you may have heard of named Leland Stanford. He was the guy that actually was the president of the Central Pacific Railroad. He made a fortune building the railroad as well. He was famous for building Stanford University, you've heard of, which is in California now. It's named after him. So that's the so-called Credit Mobile scandal. But I guess they got the Transcontinental Railroad, but you'll see numerous of these railroads, of course, built later. I think it's like 4 or 5 of these Transcontinental Railroads they eventually build across through the Midwest and all that. All right. Also, there's other scandals they had too. Like they had the whiskey ring that was kind of very famous, and they also had the salary grab. Was also another scandal that came about that was well known. The whiskey ring scandal was apparently a deal where a bunch of distillers were not paying their taxes on whiskey that they were making. And it was found out by this guy named Benjamin Bristow, who was the Secretary of Treasury. Found it out in 1875. It's one of the very few honest guys maybe that must have been in the Treasury. And he found there was a network of where they were giving bribes to federal agents or whatever to avoid paying taxes and all that. I think was like close to something like $1 million a year they weren't paying or something like that. And apparently there was a personal secretary of Grant, Orville Babcock. He was actually involved in it. Was actually indicted on charges that was involved with the whiskey ring, but he was later acquitted because he knew Grant and all that. And Grant kind of got him off and all that. So it obviously paid to kind of know who you're connected to and all that at the time. So there's a lot of patronage going on where people could, get influence and jobs and things like that based on who they knew and all that. It's called a spoil system and so on. The salary grab was where what happened was the Congress gave basically themselves a 50% raise in March of 1873, which also they actually gave Grant a raise. Like when Grant came in his, I think his second term, I believe, he got like a 50% raise. So did the Supreme Court justice of the Supreme Court as well. This angered everybody, which was later repealed. People weren't happy about that. And that was kind of that was really unpopular because if you know about the 1870s was not a great time in American history. During Grant's second term, the so-called Long Depression happened, which lasts like 6-7 years, where the United States is in a depression economically. So they also had this scandal with William Belknap. It's called all kinds of names. I think they call it the Trader Post scandal or the Indian trade scandal. It was called all kinds of things. I know that. And William Belknap, Secretary of War, was taking bribes from various traders in Indian territory, which I think it was in Oklahoma, is where it was. Which I think was almost like $25,000 worth of bribes or so he was getting or something, money on the side. And apparently, you've heard of George Armstrong Custer, very famous war hero and Indian fighter. He turned him in. He sent a bunch of letters that exposed what Belknap was doing. And it became a big scandal in 1876. What happened was, if you know about Belknap was one of the first. He was one of the first cabinet members to be impeached by Congress. House of Representatives impeached him in 1876, and it went to eventually to trial. And the weird thing was, he had actually resigned. They still kept going with the trial anyway. You saw what happened with Trump. They still had the trial anyway, right? Same thing happened with that. But a lot of the members of the Senate quitted him because they felt like they couldn't really find him guilty since he had resigned. You know, he was not in power anymore. So hence that's the reason for that. So Belknap basically stepped down and all of that. There's Orville Babcock on the left. He was actually in the Civil War too with Grant, which is probably why that was so with that. So yeah, Belknap right there, a picture of him. They also had this other scandal, which it's got all kinds of names that occurred. I think they call it the gold ring scandal, I think is one name they called it, or the gold corner market scandal or something like that was also what they called it as well. It's about these two Wall Street guys named Jim Fisk and Jay Gould. And what happened was in 1869, they tried to corner the gold market, like on Wall Street and all that, to control it. And they actually tried to wine and dine, believe it or not, Abel Corbin. Abel Corbin was actually the brother-in-law of Grant. He was married to one of Grant's younger sisters. And he was like a speculator of some type. And so they were trying to gain like insider trade information about the gold market by using Grant's brother-in-law. It almost worked. But apparently when the gold ring, I guess, was discovered about what they were trying to do, Grant eventually injected something like $4 million worth of gold into the market from the government. And so the whole attempt to corner the market collapsed, is what it did. But if you know what happened, it caused actually what would be called the Panic of 1869, which they think somehow, helps to influence later what would be economic depression that comes later, a few years after that, that comes in. But Fisk and Gold were investigated, but they got off because of the fact there was a lot of corrupt judges, in state governments that kind of, all connected with each other. And so they never were punished for it or anything like that. Then the one, you've probably heard of this one. This is probably considered one of the most famous scandals that happened in American history at the time, which was the Tweed ring scandal. You've probably heard of that. That was real famous, where Boss Tweed was doing a lot of corrupt things also with state government at the time. What was the Tweed ring scandal? It was this New York political scandal which involved Marcy Tweed. They called him Boss Tweed. It's a nickname. And he controlled what they call Tammany Hall. What was Tammany Hall? Tammany Hall was New York City's powerful Democratic political machine. Well, they pretty much controlled everything, not just the government, but like the economy of New York and so on. And what happened was he and his buddies, they were kind of all in together like a ring, basically stole millions of dollars from the New York government and from like taxpayers. And they did this through like bribery, kickbacks, fraudulent contracts, fixed elections. And Boss Tweed had a lot of power. He would use like a lot of his power to like get a lot of the immigrants to vote for him and other candidates. And he would give them like money, jobs in return, things like that. And you may have seen that movie called Gangs of New York. He's kind of a character in there where he even used some of the gangs of New York to kind of control things and stuff like that. And so he was really a corrupt politician. And they're not sure the amount of money that they stole. It's kind of been debated about it today, but there's been some claims that they stole anywhere from $30 to $200 million from the New York government. And later on, it was found out. I think around 1872, I think they discovered that one of the accountants, I think, who had like information on, the account books of Tweed and his associates, it was exposed, apparently. And so there was this guy named Samuel Tilden, who was a politician and lawyer, who eventually launched a bunch of investigations against Tweed. He was an anti-Tammany Democrat. And Tilden, of course, and other Democrats eventually went after Tweed, and he was eventually indicted and imprisoned for being involved with this. Although, if you know about Tweed, he actually fled the country and went to Spain. And he had to be extradited and brought back. And he went to prison and died in prison. So, anyway, that was the so-called Tweed ring. But a lot of these cities were like that. A lot of these American cities, not just New York, but many of them were very corrupt. St. Louis, Chicago, Boston, you name a city. There was a lot of corruption that was kind of going on at the time. So I want to, of course, move on. The last thing I want to talk about today is I want to get into like politics today and get into and talk about how, politics was kind of corrupt too in the late 19th century as well. And I want to talk about, of course, what happened in 1896, which is pretty big overall. Probably one of the most famous elections that happened in the late 19th century was one that happened between these two men you see there, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden, which it's almost like this election they had in 2020. It was kind of almost went to that, seemed like it overall. And so you had Rutherford B. Hayes was the governor of Ohio, I believe it's Republican, of course. And then Samuel Tilden was also a Democrat from New York. He was the governor of New York. And Tilden was considered like a reformer, pretty much with the two. I could kind of blow it up for you right there, but you can see the two right there. And I think originally there was talk of even, running Grant again for a third term, but I think that was pretty much shot down overall. So they picked Rutherford B. Hayes. He was kind of pretty much a moderate overall and was seen as an honest man. And then you see Tilden there was a big reformer. He had helped to, crack down on corruption in New York City with, Boss Tweed and all that. And so those are the two men that faced off against each other. But what happened was when the election, of course, ended, it was held on, November 7th, 1876. There was a dispute of the electoral votes, kind of like what happened in 2020, I guess. There was some kind of dispute with that, some people said. And so, those states right there, Louisiana, Florida, Oregon, South Carolina, had these disputed elections. And there was a debate about, especially the ones in the South, Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina. There was a dispute about, who should get those, Republican versus Democrat. And at that time, the votes, at least the electoral votes anyway, was 184 for Tilden. Tilden was in the lead. He only needed one electoral vote. He needed 185 to win. Hayes had 165 electoral votes, so he needed 20 to win, basically. And so controversy became over like who should get the votes. Both Republicans and Democrats said they won the elections in those states, and I think the Republicans, felt like the Democrats were trying to stop African Americans, from voting in a lot of the southern states. I think I'd say it's part of why they think why this happened and all that. And what happened was the Congress came up with this idea. They called it the Electoral Count Act. They called it of 1876, I think it was dubbed. And actually 1877, I think was when it was. And what it did was it created a commission to look into who should get the electoral votes. And so what they did was they divided the commission into like 15 members of it. 5 would come from the House of Representatives, 5 from the Senate, and 5 from the Supreme Court. So they picked 5 men from each one, basically. What happened was it just so happened that there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats that were on the commission. And you can guess how they voted. Yeah, the 8 Republicans voted for Hayes, and the 7 Democrats voted for Tilden. And so 8-7, what ended up happening, of course, was that Hayes won the election. He ends up winning because of that. And what happens was, if you know about it, the Democrats made this compromise with the Republicans that if Hayes gets the White House, okay, I want Hayes to remove whatever troops that are left in the South in Reconstruction. And so what ended up happening, if you know about it, one of the things that was a result of the 1876 election was that the Democrats took back control of the southern states. So they call themselves redeemers. I think I used that before, maybe. And then, of course, it led to the disenfranchisement of African Americans, segregation. It was all kind of snowballed afterwards. Of course, that happens. And so that was one of the things that, resulted in the end of the Reconstruction. So, so Reconstruction ended early because of what happened with this election between these 2 men. And here's another slide, of course, on the compromise of it. So the agreement was that federal troops had to be removed with those states ending Reconstruction. And they also asked for that. Of course, some things in part of the compromise you can see there. Republicans agreed to name a Southern the cabinet under Hayes. Federal spending on rebuilding the South would be also spent. Of course, would be another thing that they would do besides removing the military from the South, more or less. So that's a consequence, that will obviously be later a problem. It's going to be a long time before they really make enough reforms in the South that betters it. But you can see later that white supremacy is going to be pretty much the norm that controls a lot of the southern states for many years afterwards because of that. I don't really talk much about Hayes in a minute, but under Hayes, Hayes was the 19th. Well, he became the next president that came in next overall. The 19th president of the United States. One-term president, only in power until 1881. You can see he was not very popular. So Rutherford Hayes was not a very popular presidency. A lot of people made fun of him. They thought he wasn't really should be president. They called him his fraudulency. Or old 8-7, I think was another nickname they called Rutherford B. Hayes. And then what happened under Hayes was the Republicans split politically into 2 factions. They had one group called the Stalwarts, and the other was called the Half-Breeds. Stalwarts were Republicans. They were old guard Republicans that didn't want to make any reforms. And then the ones that were called half-breed Republicans were ones that wanted to make reforms in the spoil system and so on, make reforms to politics in general. And so those are the differences that pretty much divided the two sides at the time. Examples of ones I'll kind of give you for later, but we'll talk about, of course, these two men. You got Chester Arthur, of course, was an example of a stalwart. I think I've got a picture of these guys showing the differences between the ones that are reform-minded versus, yeah, they are right there, which is on that picture right there. So you got, yeah, the one on the far left is Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur, of course, will later be vice president under James Garfield, who will be president next after that. So he's an example. And he'll be the 21st president because, Garfield gets shot, about that killed, assassinated as an example. I don't know if you know about Roscoe Conkling, but he was another one. He was a New York senator and a stalwart, and he opposed civil service reform. He was kind of a rival to Rough B. Hayes and Garfield as well. So both were all Republican, of course. He controlled the New York Custom House, which is pretty important for trade coming into like New York, and all that, importing goods and all that. And so on. And then the guy on the far right, James Blaine, he was a senator, also Secretary of State, Blaine, as well from Maine. And he, of course, was also a big reformist as well. Actually ran for president twice in 1880 and 1884. But Blaine was sort of half-breed. He was pro-reformer and all that. Well, of course, what happened was Hayes did run for election, if you know about this, in 1880. And so they had a bunch of new candidates that ran in 1880. They had two guys, James Garfield, who was on one side that ran for election. Oh, yeah, the other guy's name, he's not, oh, there he's on the bottom right. And then the other guy they ran was Winfield Scott Hancock. He was called the Superb. Both were war heroes. Garfield had fought in the Battle of Shiloh and also Chickamauga, northern Georgia. And if you know about Hancock, he had been I think he was a general too. He had fought in the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. He's from Pennsylvania, Hancock. Anyway, so those two were kind of opposed to each other. Garfield, of course, was kind of a dark horse. His running mate was Chester Arthur, I told you about, would be his VP. You can see the top, what they ran on. Mostly in the 1880 election, the big issue was tariffs. Back in the late 19th century, that was the big thing about whether they should raise tariffs or lower tariffs. The other big thing was like the silver thing. About silver, coining silver or silver money was the other big thing that was a popular political issue in the late 1800s and all that. But that was one of the other things that was real big. Republicans favored higher tariffs, to protect a lot of the industries. And then the Democrats wanted the lower tariffs, which would help farmers. So you could buy stuff, products, especially overseas and things like that. And so that's the difference between the two different sides that you had. Garfield, of course, won the election. Electoral votes weren't that bad. I mean, Garfield won that easily, 215 to 155. But you can see there that one thing that was real famous about the 1880 election was that the actual popular vote was one of the closest in American history, like 2,000 votes for under, really. Yeah, that's amazing right there. I don't know if you know about the one between Trump and, Biden. It was like 20,000 votes in something like 3 states. That's why Biden won. It was crazy. I think also the JFK one, when JFK won and John F. Kennedy won against Nixon in 1960, it was also kind of like that, real narrow with the popular vote as well. So, yeah, I guess either one, it could have been swung either way if I guess it'd be either one at one different states in general like that. And one thing that's famous about the 1880 election, if you can show you this map here, you can see here, one thing you start seeing, which is real famous, is that you notice that the southern states start voting all Democrat again. And I don't know if I mentioned this term for that, but they often call that the so-called Solid South, which will be like this, I think, up to like the 1960s. That a lot of the southern states will pretty much vote Democrat more or less. So that's something you start seeing more and more for a long time. Now, let's talk about Garfield. Garfield was not in power very long. He was like, in fact, he was only, you know about James Garfield, he was only president for about 6 months. And if you know about Garfield, he was one of the 4 American presidents that was assassinated. It's not Garfield, by the way. That's the assassin that shot Garfield, which we'll talk about in a second. So he's like one of only 4 presidents to be assassinated. It's probably the one that's the least known out of the different assassinations overall. And apparently he was shot by this man named Charles Guiteau, who, by the way, was he was this writer. He was like a writer mostly. He was, I think, a lawyer or something like that. And he wanted to be a diplomat and be sent to like somewhere in Europe. And so he was trying to get a job with Garfield's government. And I guess when Garfield wouldn't give him an appointment or whatever, he decided to go and shoot the guy. And so apparently what happened was on the date of July 2nd, 1881, he went to the Washington, D.C.'s like main train station, and Garfield was going on a vacation, leaving Washington. And so he was waiting for the train. And so as he was waiting, Charles Guiteau walked up to him and shot him twice, like one in the arm and one in the back, basically. But he didn't fatally shoot him. He didn't die right afterwards. And a lot of people think that Charles Guiteau was insane. But he actually tried, I don't know if you know this, but he actually, well, in his trial, he tried to plead temporary insanity. Like it was one of the first trials where he actually tried to do that, more or less. And but later he would be convicted and, of course, executed for it. But Garfield for like 2 months struggled pretty much because of medical reasons. They think it was all due to his doctors. His doctors evidently had not used, correct medical procedures, and could, back in those days, they just pretty much just didn't wash their hands or anything like that. And so his wound got basically infected. They couldn't find the bullet, which was buried inside him somewhere. And so in September 1881, he died from complications, basically. So that's how Chester Arthur becomes president, 21st president of the United States, of course, because of afterwards of Garfield getting shot. Guiteau, by the way, be hanged on June 30th, 1882. That's when he was executed. And they've actually made plays, and there's actually a song or something, the Charles Guiteau song or something, or folk song or something like that, that was kind of popular. That was made from that, of course, later. Why was Garfield's assassination important? Well, apparently Garfield's assassination led to a bunch of reforms afterward. There's some interesting facts about Garfield if you want to look at that, which is right there. But basically, because of him getting shot, it led to a bunch of reforms afterwards. And of course, the big thing that happened was the so-called Pendleton Civil Service Act came out afterwards, a Reform Act in 1883. And they believe this was one of the main acts that helped to end what they call the spoil system in federal government. And before that, you could get like basically a job if you knew like a politician. They call it the patronage system, more or less. And so after that, a lot of the jobs in the federal government, if you wanted to get it, it was all based on merit. And they had like this deal where you had to take civil service exams to actually, if you ever applied for a civil service job, you have to have some kind of exam that you have to pass before they can even interview you and all that. And so the Civil Service Commission was created from that afterwards. And so that kind of also helped to basically prevent a lot of the spoil system from going on. Also, if you're a federal employee, you cannot give money to politicians, like running for campaigns or whatever. And so that's something else you see today. And a lot of state governments, local governments also as well. Like I can't give any money to campaigns because I'm basically like kind of like a state employee, more or less. So also another thing that happened too, because of I think I've got some slides on these if you want to look at them later that I've got. So yeah, the Pendleton Act, I think is what they usually called it for short, more or less. That was part of it. They also had the so-called Presidential Succession Act of 1886. That was something else that was also created too, as well. What it did was it created an order of succession, like if the president and vice president got killed, more or less, he would decide who would become president. And so what they did was they decided that it would be an order of the cabinet positions that had been created back in the beginning of the Republic. And so after the president, vice president died, the Secretary of State would come next, then the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and so on, the order. Of course, today, that's no longer in that order anymore. They do have another act that basically succeeded that one, Presidential Succession Act of 1947. That one, of course, that's the order now. So if the president, vice president dies for some reason, Speaker of House become president, president pro tempore of the Senate, then the Secretary of State, then after that, the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and so on. I want to talk about one other election that was also famous, that was kind of corrupt and kind of also kind of mudslinging, which was kind of well known. And that was the 1884 election that occurred. This is a pretty famous one. In fact, it's one of the most mudslinging elections probably in American history that you can really think of that occurred. And it was between these two men, which were James Blaine, of course, from Maine, who I talked about before, Secretary of State and Senator. And then yet Grover Cleveland, who was the governor, I think governor of New York at one point as well. He was the other one, of course, that also was involved in this election. And what happened was they found out that James Blaine was kind of corrupt, more or less. I talked about graft and all that and corruption, politicians taking bribes and things like that. And apparently some of the Republicans who were more reformers, like those half-breeds, didn't like the idea of Blaine being too cozy with like big business and things like that. And so he alienated a lot of those guys, and all the reformist Republicans, who were called mugwumps, decided they were going to back Grover Cleveland. Kind of like the ones that didn't like Trump, what do they call them? The non-Trumpers, where they called them, basically that supported, Biden or something like that. It's kind of like the same thing with the mugwumps, basically. Oh, and then the other thing that happened, they didn't like Blaine because Blaine was kind of like some of the men under him didn't like certain immigrants like Catholic Irish and stuff like that. And so that made all the Irish and stuff vote for Grover Cleveland as we started switching parties because of that. In fact, there was some deal where there was some politician or somebody under Blaine said that the Democratic Party was the party of Romanism, rebellion. And Blaine wouldn't repudiate whatever some other guy said. And so that hurt Blaine as well when he ran for president. And so that was kind of a problem. However, what happened was the Republicans tried to counter if you know about what happened with Grover Cleveland. I don't know if you know about Grover Cleveland, but he was a bachelor at the time when he was running for power for president. And apparently he had this deal where he had fathered a child out of wedlock, which at the time that was kind of controversial. Now it's like, who cares, I guess, today. And so the Republicans made this ditty up that was called "Ma, Where's My Pa?" That's what they said about Grover Cleveland. And of course, when Cleveland won the election later, the Democrats later said, Ma, where's my pa? He's going to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. But anyway, but Grover Cleveland would win that election. And the one thing about Grover Cleveland that's interesting, of course, 22nd president of the United States. He, of course, would be the first Democrat elected to the presidency like in 28 years since James Buchanan, 1856. So it's been a long time since, of course, the Democrats have controlled, of course, the White House. Yeah, those are things that Cleveland was, of course, known for. A lot of people call him Grover the Good because he was this reformer. He was like a mugwump type reformer, or half-breed, if you want to call him as well. Cleveland was known for vetoing a lot of bills. I think they say he vetoed, I forget how many it was, some ridiculous amount of bills, the most in American history of any president ever overall. Yeah, so he's very famous for that. So very, very conservative physically. In fact, I think under his first term anyway, they actually had surplus, which is amazing for that time. They say you kind of wish they had now more than anything. And you can see some other things he did too, which are right there. I'll get to those later, but he was known for passing the Dawes Act, Interstate Commerce Act. Those are things that he helped to do under him, which a lot of those later will be various acts that will basically regulate like Indian affairs and interstate commerce in the country, like regulate railroads and things like that, which I won't talk about that now, but I'll get that done later. He was known for lowering tariffs. That's something that he did do, which was famous. And it became like also the main issue in the 1888 election. If you know what happened in the 1888 election, he lost to Benjamin Harrison. Harrison was a Republican from Indiana, the actual grandson of William Henry Harrison, you may have heard of, who didn't serve long. He died after, I think, 1 month in office or less than that. And the tariff issue was the big thing in that election, of course. And it's why he lost, apparently, with that. But one thing about Grover Cleveland, which is very famous about him, I don't know if you know much about this, but Cleveland served 2 terms. He later came back in 1892 and defeated Benjamin Harrison. And he's like the only president to serve 2 terms out of succession. It's something he's kind of famous for. I don't know if he may ever do that again, but that's something he's well known for. One more thing, I'm almost finished today. I want to talk about a few other things about that's famous at that time that I did want to mention about. I don't think I'd really talk about too much politics after that 1888 election right there, but I did want to mention about there's one thing about Benjamin Harrison, which is very famous about his presidency in the late 1880s. He was part of a period which is called the $1 Billion Congress. It's like one of the first Congresses where basically they start spending a lot of money, like $1 billion or more. And you can see it spent on a lot of things. And they, of course, raised tariffs. That was one thing they did under Benjamin Harrison. I'll get to in a second. They increased a lot of Civil War pensions as well under him. I'll get to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and all that. That's like a big thing. Like the idea to have more silver was a big thing in the late 1800s because a lot of like farmers and other people thought they ought to coin more silver in general as well. And yeah, that's a big thing that was like big in the late 19th century. You start seeing all these pensions that they start pushing, like the Pension Act of 1890 was something big that occurred where a lot of Civil War veterans, like in the Union Army, were trying to get pensions for either themselves or their spouses in general. And that's why I think that was the other reason why Cleveland was unpopular, because he kept trying to veto that. There was a lot of veterans that didn't like that too much. And so that's what caused like all these fraternal organizations, may have heard, the Grand Army of the Republic, Sons of the Confederate Veterans, United Daughters of the Confederates, and things like that were all created to basically get pensions more or less for themselves and maybe for their spouse or children and all of that. And also it led to a lot of like, not just pension grabs, but, they also started building like statues and memorials, to honor all these different, veterans and so on. And that's why you have all these statues later. I know they talk about white supremacy as the reason for why they built all these statues, like from the Civil War and all that. But a lot of it was because the veterans were still alive at the time. A lot of them were, like even up to the 1880s and 90s. A lot of Civil War veterans were pretty much still around and all that. And they were trying to honor them and so on. So that's why all that kind of happened at the time. But I'm gonna get more into like later politics. I won't get like too much into that time period. I think when I get to like 1892, 96, I'll get more into like the time when William McKinley comes in. We'll talk about that. That's kind of a controversial period